Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off by discussing U.S. politics once again in today's show. We're going to hone in on Joe Biden, who is the current president of the United States, and the fact that he has now signed an executive order to reverse Donald Trump's, as we know it, quote-unquote, Muslim ban, that travel ban that he put in place originally just on Muslim countries, and then he added a few other countries, such as Venezuela, into that list as well. Nevertheless, the majority are Muslim countries, or were Muslim countries at least, till Biden signed this order. Is it possible to completely reverse even the effects of what the order have done to many families in the U.S. and around the world? Those who, A, were planning to move to the U.S. to begin with, those who were trying to reunite with family members around the world, bring them over for whatever reason altogether, all those canceled visas, all those canceled opportunities to spend time with family, as well as, of course, a whole host of other issues as well. Those are all very important effects which also need to be discussed and need to be understood about how exactly that will now play out in the coming days, months, and years. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Saher Selod, who is joining us from Boston, Massachusetts. She's an associate professor of sociology at Simmons University. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Saher Khamis, who is a professor of communication at the University of Maryland. And joining us from Newark, Delaware, is Dr. Muqtedar, who is a professor of Islam and Global Affairs, Islamic Political Thought. Muqtedar, Sahar, and Sahar, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Muqtedar, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of the reversal of the Muslim ban? That's certainly something to be celebrated. But what of then, being able to take back a lot of the effects of the Muslim ban? I mean, that I imagine is a much harder task.
Well, first of all, I think congratulations for President Biden for fulfilling one of his election promises, which is to go right ahead and revoke the Muslim ban on day one. It included not only Muslim countries, but additional countries from Africa. So it has become a pretty large contingent of over a dozen countries. But what is also interesting is that it not just revokes the ban and says that now people in these Muslim countries, especially like Iran and other places, can apply for visas, but about 42,000 people who were denied entry into the United States can now apply for visas. But the ban also, if you read the executive order, it also orders the State Department to completely redo its visa processes, its application processes. And this will also have a serious positive impact on the refugee situation. The United States has started refusing refugees, even from places like Myanmar, under this travel ban. But that's not the end of it. There is also a law that is already passed in the House, which seeks to essentially ensure that in future no precedent can pass such a ban. It passed the House. It failed in the Senate because the Republicans control the Senate, but now that the Democrats have marginal control on the Senate, there is hope that that bill will pass in the Senate, and therefore in the future, presidents cannot use executive orders to essentially ban people from other countries based on either their religion, their ethnicity. And so that is an important thing, but what we need to watch for is to see how meticulously this policy is executed. The State Department has been completely depleted. So will they be able to hire people quickly and try and in the next few months reunite people? The number is about 42,000 people have been waiting to meet their loved ones for the last 4 years.
Saher Selod, we all remember those images, right, of lawyers at the airports across the U.S. Trying to, defend a lot of those people that were being denied entry into the U.S. And we even had, I was in Iran at the time when this ban came into place. I was a journalist there, and there were Iranian children, young children, minors, who were blocked from entering the country and were not allowed to even see their parents in some cases, or their grandparents in other cases. And, those sorts of images have caused a lot of damage, haven't they? Of course, to the U.S. image, that's an obvious one, but secondly, just to the human rights of all these people as well. I mean, is that something that one can even hope for accountability and justice for at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And something we're always thinking about is, This is one executive order by President Biden, which, I don't want to underscore how important it was that he did it so quickly after he took office. I think that messaging is really important, particularly when you're thinking about human rights and, the Muslim immigrants who were denied entry into the United States. However, I have to, give some pause and really, if you understand what's been going on in the United States since 9/11 and the war on terror, you would know that there are multiple laws and policies in the United States that have really had a huge impact on particularly the Muslim immigrant population here. So it's impacted Muslim citizens for sure, but initially, like the USA Patriot Act, which targeted Muslim non-citizens. So this is, one executive order that President Trump passed and that President Biden has reversed, and there's certainly hope with more policies like the No Ban Act, but there are so many others in the United States that have targeted Muslims in the name of national security. So we have a long way to go to undo all of those, which I hope President Biden and his administration will start paying attention to as well.
And then Sahar, Khamis, the other challenge I would think is that many officials, especially at airports, have probably been in some ways conditioned, right, to look out for people from those countries. I mean, how does one walk back that sort of prejudice which has then been placed into the minds of, be it passport control officers or others?
Thank you for having me. Indeed, we have to contextualize this, the Muslim travel ban that the ex-president or former president Donald Trump has implemented on January 27th, 2017, which was, of course, an unconstitutional act. And it's a shame that the Supreme Court has passed it by a majority of 5-4 in 2018, because it's really based on religious discrimination. That is what it's really about. And it really, I believe, has a context of Islamophobia and fear of Islam and Muslims, which was clearly revealed in a number of acts and actions that even preceded this decision. If you look at, for example, the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism Program, that was implemented even before Trump took office. And it's a very bad program because it was really based on, surveillance of Muslim communities and always, framing them as if they are, quote unquote, the enemy. They are scary. They are a threat to national security. We have to really kind of pay attention to them and keep a very, careful eye on their actions and movements and what they're doing, as if they are the, quote unquote, source of threat to American security. Although we know from, scientific research, Pew and others have clearly indicated that at least 94% of or 96% of terrorist acts committed on U.S. soil were committed by groups that have nothing to do with Islam or Muslims, mainly white supremacist groups. But that's not where the national security interest and attention has been, paid or given, unfortunately. Other acts like, surveillance of mosques, acts like, for example, a registry, Muslim registry or Muslim no-fly lists, all of these have also been Islamophobic acts. So really, I agree totally with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar when she said that this Muslim travel ban was not born out of thin air, and that although repealing the act, which is of course a great thing that the new president Joe Biden has done on day one of his administration, as he promised during his campaign, this is a great act, but at the same time, we cannot expect that the damage or the long-term effects are going to end in just a few minutes. Exactly. It might take weeks, months, or in some cases, even years.
Muqtedar, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because the Supreme Court, the fact that, it was okay with this sort of ban, of course, as you correctly mentioned in your earlier answer, including other countries, such as countries in Africa and others. Nevertheless, the fact that the Supreme Court was okay with even that revised version of the ban, that's also disturbing, right? Because then at this point, yes, Biden, the one man, has been able to carry out his promise to repeal this. But what's to say tomorrow, after Biden, for example, that the Supreme Court would not side with the next president who wants to bring such a ban back to the fore? I mean, that's disturbing in and of itself that the Supreme Court agrees with this, right?
Well, there are two things that you have to understand, that this is not just one man who's done this, but about 84 million Americans who voted for Biden, who repeatedly during his campaign made this promise. So people knew that if Biden was elected, the Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban, would be revoked. So in that sense, you could argue that a clear majority in America is in favor of revoking this Muslim ban. The second thing is that you must understand that when the courts were looking at it, they're not looking at it rhetorically. It's not called a Muslim ban, it's called a travel ban. It does not ban Muslims from all Muslim countries, from Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, a vast majority. We're looking at only 5 Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, and other African countries from where a large number of people who do come are Muslims indeed. And so the Supreme Court's decision 5-4 was not an affirmation of discrimination based on religion, but the Supreme Court essentially acknowledged that on matters of national security, the president has a certain degree of leverage. So it's essentially a balance of power between what powers does the president have under national security issues to keep the country safe. So it was that debate which was lost 5-4 in the Supreme Court. But I think that if the No Ban Act is passed, in the Senate, and that is where civil society and civil society organizations, which have worked so hard in the last 3 to 4 years to pressure Biden to include this in his agenda, and also lots of American politicians, Senator Coons of Delaware himself, Senator Harper, they were quite aggressive from the moment this Muslim ban was revoked to oppose it. So what is going to happen is that once the No Ban Act is passed, then no other president, Democrat or Republican or an independent from a third party, would be able to use executive orders to pass. Executive orders by nature are not laws. You know, they are temporary measures taken by the president. It's like using a credit card in the absence of a big loan. So it's a temporary measure, and that power of the president can be stricken off by laws.
Right. I'm just going to give the final comments from Dr. Selod and Dr. Khamis. Let me start with you, Dr. Selod. What are your thoughts about what now happens going forward, or what needs to happen, in fact, going forward? I mean, it seems like it's fairly complex. I mean, yes, it's nice to have this signed into reality, but nevertheless, what is the next step, logical step then, to roll back the sort of prejudicial policies?
Yeah, thank you. I think what has to happen next is we have to really think about security and these laws that have been put into place in the name of national security and to prevent terrorism. And part of the problem is that we've, in the United States, terrorism has unfortunately become equated with a Muslim identity or somebody who practices Islam. So, after the Capitol riots, for example, I was listening to the news and hearing them talk about expanding CVE, which, as was previously noted, countering violent extremism that the Obama administration had put into place, really has been used to target a Muslim population in the United States. So I think while, the ban is one thing, like I said before, there are multiple policies in the United States that are meant to protect us from another terrorist attack, but they once we have an understanding of terrorism as being committed by a Muslim, which is racializing, a Muslim identity to equate Muslims with terrorism, you're going to see all these laws and policies that unfairly discriminate against Muslims.
And Khamis, I'll give you the final word. What needs to happen next, in your opinion?
I think besides passing the No Ban Act, which would really prevent any other president in the future from using his powers or her powers, since we hope to have a woman president, in the near future, hopefully, it's really important to prevent others from using their executive powers to pass such types of, laws or actions or executive orders, which I still hold my position are unconstitutional in essence and in spirit on the basis of religious discrimination. Because there were 7 Muslim majority countries that were on this list, and pretty much it was Islamophobic and fear of the other. I think that beside that as well, we have to think about the activism, the organization, and the coordination of the American Muslim community. We have a new era a new dawn and a new hope under the new administration of Joe Biden. We, the American Muslim community, have to also organize, coordinate, and try to be strong, lobbies and strong, interest groups, and have a loud voice, both in the social and the political domains, and try to make our demands clearly heard and communicate well with the new administration, make sure that our voices are well heard and that our interests are well expressed and well articulated. And I think we have a much better chance of doing that under the administration of Joe Biden, because he has really expressed interest in inclusion, diversity, reaching out to others, and he said that he's going to be a president for all Americans. So I think this is a very important opportunity and a golden moment that we should try to build upon.
Golden opportunity. We'll have to leave there as a final word, but we appreciate Doctors Selod, Khamis, and Khan for taking their time out this morning, speaking to us from Boston, Washington, and Newark, respectively, sharing their expertise with us about the fact that Joe Biden has lived up to his promise. So this is a positive story on the face of it, of course. He has repealed or reversed, if I may use that term, Donald Trump's quote-unquote Muslim ban. Now, of course, we can debate the details of this, right? It's not all, yes, Muslim countries that were part of this travel ban. But nevertheless, there was a majority of Muslim countries in that. Originally, this started out as a ban just on Muslim countries. So that narrative, that intention was very clear from day one. Nevertheless, can we roll back the effects of this, the injustices that have been caused, the human rights that have been violated because of this ban? And what of then, as Dr. Selod there mentioned in her answers, what of the other policies that also target Muslim Americans? Will we also discuss that? Will Biden also be pressured to correct those wrongs? And then, of course, the elephant in the room for myself, at least, is the fact that the Supreme Court even sided with this ban altogether. That in and of itself says a lot about where the establishment's thought process is when it comes to such policies altogether. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Tunisia. There have been protests there for, I believe, 6 nights in a row across the country, really, especially in the capital, Tunis. And now we know that Tunisia is an extremely important country for many reasons, but one of the important reasons is also the fact that it was the first Arab Spring country, really, if we think about it, with Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali being overthrown in a successful fashion in a revolution, which didn't turn out to be too violent, at least in comparison to the likes of the other revolutions that had taken place during the Arab Spring. Also, nevertheless, all these years later, the economic hardships are still there, that there are other issues. Unemployment, youth unemployment especially, still very much exists, all exacerbated certainly by the pandemic, and that's a context which every country around the world is grappling with. But nevertheless, Tunisia has had governance issues even since the fall of Ben Ali. Why hasn't it been able to pick itself up, so to speak, and succeed when it comes to the revolution that was so hard fought for? Let's discuss that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Arnaud, who is an associate professor of justice studies at Montclair State University. He's joining us this morning from Brooklyn, New York. Arnaud, thank you very much for joining us this morning. What do you make of the protests as they're happening right now in Tunisia, as well as, the response to it on the part of the government? The government saying, okay, we agree with your demands, but just don't become violent.
Thank you so much for having me on the air, Waqar. It's a pleasure being here. And as you said, the protests are quite concerning, but they come at a moment of sort of dire despair of the population in Tunisia. And we have a few things we have to grapple here with, right? You mentioned that Tunisia, after the fall of Ben Ali in 2011, basically a decade ago, we still have not found the right path to a democratic transition. And I would like to sort of put a word of caution in here, because when we think in broader contexts that after the French Revolution, for instance, it took France over 100 plus years to really consolidate their democracy. And even when we look at the sort of the protests and the attacks at the Capitol on January 6th that happened in the US, which is also a young democracy with only a couple hundred years of experience, show that democracies are dynamic and organic structures. And so, as you said, the pandemic here was really, really crucial, because until the midsummer, Tunisia was faring really well with regards to how to cope with the pandemic, but it was due to severe lockdowns, which then had drastic consequences for the economy. And if you have already a sluggish economy, you pointed out that there's over a third of Tunisian youth. We have to remind our listeners here and viewers that the median age in Tunisia is under 30 years. So it's a large population society that has and builds on its youth. And if a third of them, I think unemployment rates were sort of in at the later part of 2020 up to 18%. And to put that in perspective, in the US, when we say we don't have unemployment in a good booming economy, it hovers between 3 and 5%. So 18 is a drastic measure, and that discontent then here translated into street protests. So January 14th was the anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the semi-peaceful transition and ouster of Ben Ali. There were several hundred people that were victim to the basically ouster, and so in that context, I think we need to think that the violence that happens in the street is not the only sign, right? And the violence, the government has two issues that they need to grapple with. I think one is the legitimate monopoly of violence, right? Max Weber. If there's violence, we need to confront it. But to what extent does the authoritarian past really go in and then bring about bad memories and ravage the crowds even more? And to what extent are there other political forces that I can get into in a second that then, through a populist behavior and discourse, make that even worse, right? Ennahda or populists like Abri Moussi have certainly not helped in that regard.
Arnaud, if I may push you on the point of, you spoke about that possibly before the pandemic hit, that things were going okay. But then, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I remember in the early days, right after the revolution taking place and Ben Ali had left, we had, we've continued to have power struggles, haven't we, in Tunisia ever since Ben Ali's ouster, where it has been Ennahda and, it's been Said Kais, and, it's been one after the other, but it doesn't seem that any one person's been able to stick and to complete their tenure. Am I correct in saying that?
Correct. So I think I work on issues how societies grapple with their past and how they transition from a post-conflict society or sort of post-authoritarian society into a more democratic one. And as you can imagine, there's many, many layers. And you're absolutely correct that the Tunisian government has been grappling with regards to, especially in the last couple of years, to establish sort of political forces that stay. And that's due to several factors, right? First, there's this power game. Ennahda, for instance, was, of course, brought into power, for instance, Ben Ali, when he first took over in the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s, he really relied on Ennahda to build his political force. And once he had established his legitimacy as an autocratic leader, he sort of banned them again. And so there was this flirtation with power. And so Ennahda, once they were legitimately and through the ballot box integrated into the system, was also trying to get a hold of power in Tunisian politics. And so this brought about a lot of tension between the secular forces and then sort of more religious powers in the country. And so I think the issue that we have now is that Tunisian democracy needs more of a civil society, even though throughout, and that's quite ironic, throughout the dictatorship years and autocratic regimes, even with its founder, Habib Bourguiba, there was a lively civil society, and even human rights advocates were in the country. But again, that is ironic when you think about how human rights coexist with dictators. And I Watch or Nawat and others or Manish Masema are really really great examples how youth has harnessed their power to point to corruption, to point to these structures that need to be changed. And so I think there's still a lot to do, but there is sort of a growing, I mean, for instance, the last prime minister, was ousted by iWatch because of a corruption scandal, right? And that's endemic, and that needs to be addressed.
So, if we're completely honest, a lot of people would look to Tunisia, again, as the standard bearer, the flag bearer, if I may use that, in fact, term, of the Arab Spring overall, right? Do you think that in some ways that Tunisia may be, and, maybe this is an uber pessimistic point of view, but is it heading the way of Egypt, where we had that second revolution and now we have a dictator very much back in power, very much the likes of Mubarak in some ways? Is Tunisia heading that way, or is it just in perpetual chaos till we hit a point where finally some stability comes into the country? Because as you correctly alluded to in your earlier answer, I mean, these things do take time to develop.
I think 2 points are in order here. First, when we think about the apparatus and the regime that is in place in Egypt, it really relies on the military. And the military was the driving force. When you look at the leaders, with the exception of Morsi, they were all generals, and there's a long array of history here. Tunisia is quite different. Ben Ali's state apparatus was really reliant on security forces and the security apparatus. But the military forces, and particularly the army, was seen as, to a certain extent in Egypt as well, as a social mobility factor, but it was seen as the friend of the people. And even so, during the transition, the soldiers were sort of, and the army wasn't considered as part of the state security apparatus. And so that is something that we need to keep in mind. That said, of course, I mean, the risk of sort of instrumentalization of the military forces by a regime does exist now, and the current president, Kais Saied, has the nickname of RoboCop, and so, but again, he's also a lawyer by training, and so he's tried really hard to create a technocratic government. And so, as I said, there's a fine line between where do we need to go with regards to making sure there is no violence and riots in the streets, plus public order, but then do that within a sort of democratic fashion where the forces are only used in a meaningful way. And maybe if I may, we can draw a parallel to the US, right, where DC, when the Capitol was attacked by a mob, DC had to establish the National Guard, and DC is not a state, right? No taxation without representation. And so this idea that the mayor had to call the National Guard and it didn't show up at first, and then when the National Guard was there, people were still afraid that there could be insiders within the Guard that could still then help overthrow the government. So it is a tricky and slippery slope, but I don't see that coming for Tunisia.
Arnaud, the clock has gotten the best of us, but we appreciate your taking your time out and speaking to us this morning from Brooklyn, New York, sharing your expertise with us about Tunisia and the latest political upheaval there. We've had now, 6 straight nights of protests in several cities across that country. This all just after, really, the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring and the overthrow of Ben Ali, Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali, who was a longtime dictator and ruler of Tunisia. That essentially was the first spark of the Arab Spring, if we all remember, a decade ago. Has the revolution failed? Maybe it is too early, as Arnaud said. I mean, it does take time for these things to develop. And of course, each country has its own context. So maybe the comparison to Egypt is not completely correct. But nevertheless, it's hard to be optimistic at this point in time looking at Tunisia because unemployment is still high. So many of the issues that existed under Ben Ali's rule vis-a-vis the demands and grievances that people had, and that is why they then arose against him, still very much exists. So we're still in danger, aren't we, of things possibly sliding backwards instead of forwards for the country. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. And on the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a statement by the head of the WHO, the World Health Organization. As we know, of course, we are in the midst of a vaccination program, especially in the more developed world. The developing world at this point in time is very much still figuring out how on earth they will get their COVID-19 vaccines. Some countries have ordered vaccines, and of course, there's a number of them available on the market, aren't they? But the WHO head has warned, and he's used the phrase catastrophic moral failure, that the world is on the brink of that at this point in time. And he's warned about this before, too. He's spoken about nationalism when it comes to these health issues. But the one thing which comes to mind when we talk about coronavirus, and we've spoken of that previously in this show as well, is that this affects all of us. And if this pandemic were to remain in any shape or form anywhere in the world, that would then be a risk to the rest of the world as well. So we need to deal with this in a fashion which is equal and just throughout the world, because it's in fact in our own interest to do so. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Elona Kickbush, who is professor at the Graduate Institute at the Geneva Global Health Center. She's joining us today from Bern in Switzerland. Ilona, thank you very much for taking your time out to speak to us here in Scope. What do you make of Ghebreyesus' his warning about the moral failure of the world when it comes to the hogging of these vaccines? The numbers are quite staggering, right? I believe Canada's ordered something like 5 times the amount it needs, and the U.S. possibly 3 times the amount it needs. I mean, that sort of defies logic, doesn't it?
Yes, and that is the great worry we have in global health, the enormous inequality in vaccine distribution. And of course, we see that the developed countries are also under tremendous pressure by their populations to vaccinate broadly. Suddenly, the vaccine skepticism that many of these countries have had has moved to the back burner. So the concern of the Director General of the WHO is totally correct. We see that hardly any vaccination has taken place in the poorest countries. About 60 million vaccinations have happened in 52 countries. And if you look at those 52, most of them are developed countries. Of course, China has vaccinated a significant number as well. US and China actually lead the charge in the number of people they have vaccinated.
So then how does one ensure equal distribution? Because, one of the challenges here is that pharmaceutical companies, especially, and we can pick on Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, they want to make a buck off of all of this, right? That's sort of their business model. How does one ensure that at the same time as then equal distribution of those vaccines to countries which can't actually probably afford to pay the full amount?
Well, there are various approaches. One is that WHO early on with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, a group that's very familiar to Pakistan from the immunization of children, that they came together to create an initiative called COVAX, which invited countries to come together to actually share the distribution and the financing of vaccines. That was very much hampered by the fact that under the Trump administration, the US did not join, and that led to a financial pressure on COVAX. We now have the information that the US will join COVAX probably with $3 billion US dollars, and that will make it easier to distribute vaccines to the poorest countries. But we also see that some countries now under international pressure, that includes Canada, Norway has already done so, have said that they will donate the supplementary vaccines they have to COVAX and to developing countries. So that is another way. And of course, countries like China, to some extent also India, are making vaccines that they have developed and they can produce, are making them available to other countries. And I understand that China is also making some of their vaccines available to Pakistan. So it's various streams that are happening at the same time, and that is important, and you alluded to it. There is the issue of intellectual property, and South Africa together with India, have made an approach in the World Trade Organization that is responsible for that such an important vaccine or group of vaccines as against the COVID-19, that intellectual property should actually be waived. And again, we have a big difference there that many of the Western countries are actually arguing against such a waiver.
Yeah, so I mean, then the honest truth then is, right, that through 2021, we don't actually know when the entire world, if even possible, if it's even possible in 2021 to actually have the whole world vaccinated. I mean, maybe I'm being too optimistic by even saying the whole world, right?
Well, there is the opportunity, there is the potential if we all share, as Dr. Tedros said, no one is safe until all are safe. And the United Kingdom, which now chairs the G7, called on all countries that now that we have a vaccine, we must come together for a global vaccination drive that includes all countries, particularly the producer countries, so that we can vaccinate quickly. And of course, many of the developing countries have an infrastructure. Some of the developing countries are better prepared for a vaccination drive than actually the rich countries, as we've seen. And it needs the rich countries to actually understand what this means in economic terms. There's been a calculation that such a global drive would cost about $25 billion. Quite honestly, in terms of the global GDP, that's peanuts. And it's been calculated that the benefit for the developed countries economically would lie by around $120 billion. So there would even be a big push of self-interest if the developed countries only woke up and started to be solidaric.
There's a lot of talk, Ilona, isn't there, about vaccine passports of some sort of, documentation to then allow people to travel around the world. That's a huge thing, right? The travel industry, as you well know, has been hurt hard, and so is tourism. There's a lot of interests at stake here for many, many countries around the world. That would also then set up almost a classless system, would it not? Because if the reality is that some countries will not get the vaccine till much later on, that just sort of ensures that there will be this odd system where certain countries will be then almost bubbled out, completely cordoned off, if I may use that term, if we go down the path that we're continuing at this point.
You're totally correct, and that is why the WHO has argued strongly against this type of, COVID passport approach. There is talk that within certain geographic areas that this might apply. Think of the European Union that has no borders and is being forced to, partly establish them because of the way some countries are thinking. But on a global level, it is a totally irresponsible, I would say, approach, which would create a new kind of vaccine apartheid. Beyond not getting the vaccine, then you're going to be discriminated against as a country, your population, with the exception perhaps of your elite, in terms of travel. This is unheard of, and this is irresponsibly political behavior.
All right, Ilona, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule, no doubt, to speak to us today and to share your expertise with us. That was Ilona, who was speaking to us there from Switzerland, sharing her thoughts on the WHO head, Tedros Ghebreyesus, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, that is, discussing the catastrophic moral failure of how the vaccine distribution is taking place around the world as we speak. Richer countries obviously hoarding the vaccines. We've spoken about that before here in Scope also. What does this mean for the poorer countries? What have the vaccine manufacturers themselves. Obviously, they want to make a quick buck in all of this. Certainly, they've put a lot of resources into this, but most of those resources have ran back taxpayer money. And on top of all of this, as I mentioned in my introduction, is the fact that we are interconnected. If this virus remains in any part of the world, that endangers other parts of the world, regardless of how developed or developing those countries and populations may be. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.